The mansion stood like a fortress of glass and steel against the biting Chicago winter, a symbol of success that reached coldly into the sky. Inside, the halls were filled with a silence so heavy it seemed to press against your chest with every step. Alexander Winters, a billionaire known in elite circles as Mr. Freeze, sat alone in his grand leather chair, surrounded by the kind of luxury that most people only dream about. He was a man who wore wealth like armor, sharp, impenetrable, and always perfectly in place. He had built his empire from nothing, brick by brick, deal by deal, sacrificing everything along the way, including the warmth that once lived inside him. After losing his wife years ago, his home had become less of a place to live and more of a monument to everything he had achieved, a museum of success with no one left to share it with. To the outside world, Alexander Winters had it all. 2. The people who worked inside those walls, he was simply someone to avoid. His expectations were sky high, his patience was razor thin, and his words, when he bothered to speak at all, could cut deeper than any blade. The staff moved carefully around him, like people walking on ice, always aware that one wrong step could send everything crashing. But that night, a single flickering light in the kitchen would lead him to a truth he never expected, one that would quietly, permanently shatter the walls he had spent years building around his heart. Among the staff was a 24-year-old maid named Emily. She was quiet, soft-spoken, and almost invisible, moving through the mansion like a shadow that no one ever thought to look at twice. She wore the same patched uniform every day, her shoes cracked and worn thin from the endless hours of labor that stretched from early morning, well past the time everyone else had gone home. Most of the staff barely noticed her. Alexander certainly didn't, or at least he told himself he didn't. But lately, he had begun to notice a pattern, and it bothered the part of him that ran his life like a perfectly optimized machine. Long after the other staff had collected their things and gone back to their families, their warm apartments, their evening meals, Emily was still there. He told himself it was an inefficiency, a scheduling problem, something to address in the morning with the household manager. He ignored it for days, then a week, then longer. But one night, the house settled into the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel enormous. And Alexander found himself walking toward the kitchen for a glass of water when he saw her. The dim light above the sink cast a pale, tired glow across her face. Her hands, red and cracked from hours spent in freezing water, moved slowly across the same marble countertop she had already cleaned earlier that evening. Her shoulders carried a weariness that went far beyond physical exhaustion. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't pretending to be busy. She was simply working quietly and carefully, long after anyone was left to notice or care. Alexander frowned. It was past midnight. Why was she still here? His young son, Noah, had noticed too. Noah was 7 years old and had inherited none of his father's coldness. The boy had a gentleness about him, a natural curiosity about the people around him, and he had quietly watched Emily for weeks from the shadows of the hallway. That night, Noah had slipped out of bed and found his father standing in the corridor, staring toward the kitchen light. He reached up and tugged gently on Alexander's hand, his eyes wide and full of a sincerity that only children seem capable of. Daddy, he whispered, she's still here again. Why does she always look so sad? The question landed somewhere deep. Not because it was profound, it was a child's simple observation, but because Alexander realized he had no answer. He had never once thought to ask. He walked into the kitchen, his voice carrying its usual authority, though something beneath it had shifted just slightly. Emily, it is past midnight. Your shift ended hours ago. Why are you still here scrubbing a floor that is already spotless? She jumped at the sound of his voice, her face going pale. She dropped her rag immediately and began fumbling to gather her things, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on the floor to avoid his gaze. "I'm so sorry, sir," she whispered. "I just wanted to make sure everything was perfect. I'll go right now. I'm sorry." Her voice was barely above a breath, the voice of someone who has spent a long time making herself as small as possible. But as she turned toward the door, Alexander noticed something that stopped him cold. She wasn't heading toward the staff parking area. She wasn't pulling out a phone to call someone. She was bundling herself up in a thin, inadequate coat, preparing to walk out into the dark, snow-covered Chicago night on foot. Something moved inside Alexander. Not guilt exactly, not yet, but something older and rawer. Something he had buried under years of boardrooms and balance sheets and the careful construction of a man who didn't need anything from anyone. He followed her to the mudroom. "Emily, wait. It is freezing outside. Let me have someone call you a car." She shook her head without turning around, her pride fighting visibly against something else, something that looked a lot like desperation. "I can't accept that, sir." "Thank you, but I'm fine." She paused, then added quietly, almost to herself, "Besides, I'm in no rush to get back." He should have let her go. The old version of him would have. Instead, he asked her why not. What came out over the next few minutes was not a single dramatic confession, but a slow, reluctant unraveling, the way truth tends to come out when someone has kept it hidden for a very long time. Emily's home, if it could be called that, was a tiny room in a run-down building across the city. The building's heating system had broken down weeks ago, and the landlord had made it clear, in the way that people in power sometimes do, that repairs were not a priority. Her room was so cold at night that she slept in her coat. She had been staying late at the mansion, not because she was chasing overtime pay. Alexander hadn't even offered her any, but because the mansion was warm. It was the only place she could go where the cold didn't follow her. She cleaned obsessively, perfectly, relentlessly, because she was terrified that if she ever seemed less than indispensable, someone would notice she was really just a young woman with nowhere warm to go. She kept the lights off in her room at home to save money on the electric bill. Alexander stood very still and said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked the question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "How long has it been like this?" She told him. Longer than he expected. Long enough that it had simply become her life, something to manage, to work around, to survive. But the story didn't end there. Because Emily, it turned out, was not just surviving. She was doing something that Alexander, with all of his wealth and all of his resources, had never thought to do. With the small amount of money she saved by not heating her own room, by skipping her own lunches, by wearing the same worn-out shoes until they fell apart, she was paying for school lunches for 3 children in her neighborhood. Kids whose mothers were gone, or working 3 jobs, or simply not there. Kids who showed up to school hungry and invisible, the way Emily herself had once been. She fed them so they wouldn't feel the particular hollow loneliness of sitting at a lunch table with nothing in front of you while the world moves on around you, like you don't exist. She had never told anyone. She hadn't done it for recognition. She had done it because she remembered what that hunger felt like, and she had decided, quietly and without any fanfare, that as long as she had anything at all to give, she would give it. Alexander felt something break open in his chest. He was a man who had built a reputation on being untouchable, and standing in the mudroom of his own home at midnight, looking at a young woman in a cracked coat who had less than nothing and still gave what she had. He felt the full weight of who he had become. He thought about all the times he had walked past her without seeing her, all the meetings he had sat in discussing profit margins, while this woman, this quiet, invisible person on his own staff, was quietly doing more good with nothing than he had done with everything. He didn't make a grand speech. He wasn't that kind of man. But he also didn't let her walk out into the snow. Over the following weeks, Alexander acted. Not loudly, not in a way designed to be seen or praised, but deliberately and completely. He moved Emily and the 3 children she had been quietly caring for into a safe, warm apartment, one he owned and had never given much thought to. He covered the costs without discussion. He connected her with a program at a local university and sponsored her enrollment so she could finally pursue the nursing degree she had quietly dreamed of for years, the dream she had packed away when life made it seem impossible. He set up proper lunch accounts for the neighborhood children so that no child in that school would sit down to an empty table again. And slowly, something unexpected happened inside the mansion itself. The kitchen, which had been a place of lonely midnight, labor, a cold room where a tired young woman scrubbed marble by herself in the dark, became something else entirely. It became a place where Noah and Emily shared breakfast on Saturday mornings, where the boys' laughter filled the corners and the sunlight came through the windows differently. Or maybe Alexander just finally noticed it. The ice that had settled over his home, that particular heaviness that comes from a life lived entirely inward, began to lift. Alexander Winters had spent years